Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. And now, you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. Important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. Every so often, I come across a story that both captures my attention and repulses my sensibilities. It's a rare instance for sure, but when it does happen, I usually take some time to process before sharing it on the show. Today's story is one of those, and honestly, I initially planned to tell the story of the LaLaurie Mansion over 2 months ago. But the more I read and researched, the more I realized it would take me some time to sit with it before sharing. So I'll tell you this up front. The story of the LaLaurie Mansion is really one about its monstrous owner, Delphine LaLaurie, who may be one of the most gruesome and prolific serial killers in American history. The cruelty with which she treated her slaves is the stuff of our worst nightmares. So a quick content warning. This episode contains graphic and brutal descriptions of slavery, racism, torture, and murder. Listener discretion is advised. What initially piqued my interest about the LaLaurie Mansion is that it's consistently ranked near the top of the list of the most haunted homes in America, and at one point was owned by actor Nicolas Cage. Except the backstory is infinitely darker, and if even half the stories about Delphine LaLaurie are true, it makes perfect sense that the home is haunted. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the horrifying history and current haunting of the LaLaurie Mansion. Who was Delphine LaLaurie? And is the mansion truly haunted? I'll share the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. Marie Delphine McCarty, who after her third marriage became known as Madame LaLaurie, and how I'll refer to her throughout, was born on March 19, 1787 in New Orleans, Louisiana, into a wealthy and influential family. The McCarty family included prominent military officers, government officials, and merchants. In 1800, at the age of 14, she married Ramon Lopez y Angulo, who was second in command to the governor of Louisiana. Except the marriage posed a problem. Lopez didn't get permission prior to marrying her, resulting in being stripped of his position and sent into exile. He was pardoned a short time later and appointed as the Spanish consul to New Orleans. But tragedy struck and he died on the return trip to Louisiana. In 1805, Delphine gave birth to their daughter in Havana, Cuba. 2 years later, in 1807, she married John Blanc, a sort of everyman who dabbled in a variety of professions, some legitimate, and some not so much. The darker aspects of Blanc's dealings included slave trading, smuggling, and associating with pirates. The two were married for 8 years and had 4 children, a son and 3 daughters, before Blanc died in 1815. She settled his debts, and soon after found herself a very wealthy woman after inheriting land and slaves from her parents. In 1825, she met Louis LaLaurie, a doctor who was 16 years her junior, after his arrival in New Orleans. The two were married in 1828, and she had their only child, a son, 5 months before the wedding. A few years later, in 1831, she bought land and built a 2-story mansion, which included slave quarters. The home at 1140 Royal Street sits in the heart of New Orleans' historic French Quarter, just a block away from the world-famous Bourbon Street. At the time that it was built, Delphine LaLaurie was a socialite whose relationship with her husband was strained, and in 1832, shortly after the mansion was built, she petitioned the First Judicial Court for a separation from her husband. She told the court that Louis LaLaurie treated her harshly, a claim that was confirmed by her son and 2 of her daughters. It would also turn out to be one of the most ironic claims in history. Because from here on out, the story takes a dark turn for the worse. Before the fire in 1834, Delphine LaLaurie was a wealthy landowner who was considered a respectable member of society. But as is often the case, public perception didn't mesh with the private reality. A slave owner, Delphine LaLaurie treated her slaves in torturous and inhumane ways, and there were rumblings that she may have even committed murder. One account recalls a 12-year-old slave girl named Leah, who pulled Delphine LaLaurie's hair while brushing it. This sent her into a rage, and she chased Leah throughout the house with a whip. Leah ran to the roof, and in desperation, threw herself over the edge, where she tumbled to her death. Madame LaLaurie then tried to cover it up by allegedly putting her body in a well. According to one article, quote, Madame LaLaurie purportedly tried to cover this up by dumping Leah's body in a well, but there were enough witnesses that the authorities came to investigate. They found Madame LaLaurie guilty of illegal cruelty and forced her to forfeit 9 enslaved people as a result. However, LaLaurie found a way around the punishment. She had her family members and friends purchase the enslaved people and sell them back to her. End quote. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out in the kitchen of the LaLaurie Mansion. When authorities arrived, they discovered something horrifying. The family cook, a 70-year-old woman, chained to the stove. She admitted to intentionally setting the fire, quote, as a suicide attempt because she feared Madame LaLaurie intended to take her to the torture room as punishment. The cook claimed that anyone taken upstairs to the room never came back. End quote. Stunned by the confession and accusation, authorities went upstairs to the attic and found, quote, several disfigured enslaved people in the attic. End quote. After the fire in 1834, Delphine LaLaurie was known as the Savage Mistress of New Orleans. An article printed in The Liberator on May 3, 1834, details the atrocities discovered by authorities. A quick warning, what I'm about to read is graphic and brutal. Quote, the New Orleans papers of the 11th make us acquainted with a scene of cruelty which has few parallels in the annals of guilt. If the wretch who perpetrated the outrage deserves anything short of death, there are crimes now punishable with death, which ought to incur a milder penalty. Yesterday, at about 10 o'clock, the dwelling house of a Mr. LaLaurie, corner of Royal and Hospital Streets, was discovered to be on fire, and whilst the engines were occupied in extinguishing it, it was rumored that several slaves were kept chained in some of the apartments. The crowd rushed in to their deliverance, and amongst others, the judge of the criminal court who demanded of Mr. and Mrs. LaLaurie where these poor creatures were kept, which they obstinately refused to disclose, when he with a manly and praiseworthy zeal rushed into the kitchen, which was on fire, followed by 2 or 3 young men, and brought for a woman, found there chained. She was covered with bruises and wounds from severe flogging. All the apartments were then forced open. In a room on the ground floor, 2 more were found chained and in a deplorable condition. Upstairs and in the garret, 4 more were found chained, some so weak as to be unable to walk. and all covered with wounds and sores. One, a boy, declared himself to have been chained for 5 months, being fed daily with only a handful of meal, and receiving every morning the most cruel treatment. 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. We saw one of these miserable beings. The sight was so horrible that we could scarce look upon it. The most savage heart could not have witnessed the spectacle unmoved. He had a large hole in his head. His body, from head to foot, was covered with scars and filled with worms. One poor old man, upwards of 60 years of age, chained hand and foot, and made fast to the floor in a kneeling position. His head bore the appearance of having been beaten until it was broken, and the worms were actually to be seen making a feast of his brains. A woman had her back literally flayed with the lash. The very bones might be seen projecting through the skin. These slaves were the property of the demon in the shape of a woman whom we mentioned in the beginning of this article. They had been confined by her for several months is the situation from which they had thus providentially been rescued, and had been merely kept in existence to prolong their sufferings, and to make them taste all that a most refined cruelty could inflict. But why dwell upon such aggravating and painful particulars? We feel confident that the community share with us our indignation, and that vengeance will fall, heavily fall upon the guilty culprit. Without being superstitious, we cannot but regard the manner in which these atrocities have been brought to light as a special interposition of heaven." End quote. Delphine LaLaurie's treatment of other human beings was cruel and evil, and the details get worse. It's important to know up front that what comes next may be a mix of truth and exaggeration. There is in fact an urban legend aspect to some of what you're about to hear, almost like a game of telephone where the truth is heard at the beginning, but by the end, and because it has passed through multiple people, only a semblance of the truth remains. Regardless, it's also important to understand that even if a small fraction of it is true, it's more than enough to place Delphine LaLaurie on a list with the most brutal serial killers in history. Authorities not only discovered human beings who were systematically tortured, but they also found the bodies of those who had been murdered. One article stated, quote, "Some victims were tied to tables. Others were confined in tiny cages. One had her limbs broken and reset so that she resembled a crab. Some had their mouths sewn shut, and others had their eyes gouged out. One witness even claimed that there were people with holes in their skulls and wooden spoons near them, presumably used to stir their brains." End quote. The number of people Delphine LaLaurie murdered varies depending on what source you're reading. I've seen numbers in the 30s, and as high as 57. Either of these would place her among the most prolific killers in American history. Upon the discovery of her gruesome crimes, Delphine LaLaurie fled from New Orleans, allegedly on a schooner that took her first to Mobile, Alabama, and then to Paris, France. She escaped to avoid accountability. Not much else is known about the last 15 years of Delphine LaLaurie's life, though it is known that she died on December 7, 1849, in Paris, France. In the almost 200 years since the fire nearly destroyed the LaLaurie Mansion, claims of it being haunted have persisted. In the 1850s, the building was renovated and later divided into apartments. But rumors of a curse soon began after various owners found themselves in financial ruin. Almost immediately upon moving in, tenants claimed to hear strange moans and groans, disembodied voices, screams coming from distant parts of the house, chains dragging, scratching under the floorboards and inside the walls, and in some instances, they smelled burning flesh. In one famous story, a dock worker who lived in one of the apartments came home to find a man standing on the stairs, blocking his path. The man was holding chains in his hands, and the dock worker asked him politely to move out of the way. Except he didn't, and remained standing there. The dock worker, annoyed that he was being ignored, attempted to push the man out of the way, and passed right through him. When he looked back, the man had vanished into thin air and without a trace. More recent paranormal phenomena include seeing strange shadow-like apparitions, phantom smells of rotting flesh, cold spots in different parts of the house, and the persistent feeling that someone is watching you. And the experiences are not limited to inside the home, as some have alleged being touched or brushed against by invisible hands while outside. And in extreme cases, several people claim to have been choked while standing on the grounds. A quick glance at Reddit reveals a variety of spooky encounters, and a few pictures of alleged ghosts standing in the upstairs window of the mansion. As of today, you can visit the LaLaurie Mansion, but unfortunately, you can't go inside. It's owned by an energy trader who purchased the home in 2010, and it has been closed to the public ever since. I mentioned it earlier. I was hesitant to tell this story because of the gruesome details. If only a small fraction of her atrocities are true, Delphine LaLaurie would still be one of the most prolific and sadistic killers in history. The story of the LaLaurie Mansion, both its history and haunting, has its roots in one of the darkest periods in American history. The barbarism of chattel slavery, the literal owning of another human being, should always be looked upon as atrocious and criminal, no matter its legality at the time. Delphine LaLaurie perpetrated evil upon evil, using human beings as the victims of her torturous experiments and to satisfy her most sadistic desires. As for the haunting, it makes sense that spirits would linger in a place with such a dark past. We can only hope that the people who were tortured, brutalized, and murdered in this life will find some semblance of peace in the next. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with this lingering question. Is the LaLaurie Mansion truly one of the most haunted homes in the United States? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.